Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. By the time the sun dragged itself over the Sawtooth Hills, Ezekiel Boone had already put 2 miles on his boots and 1 blister on his thumb. The first mile belonged to the water barrels, the second to the sagging fence around the dying mesquite. The blister fresh mean and stinging belonged to the strand of barbed wire that snapped when he leaned too hard. "World's got teeth everywhere you look," he muttered, pinching the brake closed. The wind answered with a dry hiss across. The flats dot behind him, Clementine swished her tail like a metronome, ears pricked at every grasshopper. She was slab-sided and dusty, with a Roman nose and a personality that collected opinions the way burrs collected in her mane. Ezekiel had. "No men with less will. You gonna help? Are you just thinking real hard at it?" he asked. Clementine stepped closer and planted her forehead against his shoulder in a gesture that could have meant solidarity or salt cravings. He took it as both and laughed once, a rusty sound he hadn't used in a while. His ranch was less a place than a suggestion of one, a low shack of cottonwood and scrap tin, a lean-to that pretended to be a barn if you didn't look right at it, and a windmill as still as a prayer at noon. The land was good if you were a lizard. For a man, it was. Honest but mean. For a donkey, it was a puzzle to be solved daily. Years back, when fever swept through the winter like a brush fire, Ezekiel's wife and little boy had gone one after the other, leaving behind a silence that never stopped echoing. He buried them on the ridge where the blue grama grass tried its hardest. He'd built 2 crosses and a bench of planks from a wagon tongue. Every Sunday, he'd sit and talk to the wind as if it were a pastor with all the time in the world. Then the habit thinned, the bench warped. He stayed away. The wind kept on anyway. Clementine had come after traded from a peddler who swore she could haul twice her weight and solve any gate latch designed by man. Truth was, she hauled exactly her weight and had opinions about gates, but she'd followed Ezekiel as if she'd been waiting for him at the end of a long road. When sleep wouldn't take, he'd sit on the shack step with a tin mug of coffee that tasted of scorched sage and talk to her. "You know," he'd say, "I was a good hand once. Could break a horse gentle, lay a stone chimney plumb. I could read a man's eyes and my boy's laugh. Reckon I don't read much now." Clementine would lean against him, solid as a wall and just as comforting. You could tell secrets to a donkey. They never betrayed you, and seldom cared dot on the morning the banker came. A dust devil had been practicing its letters in the far field, curling the alphabet into the scrub. Ezekiel watched it with the light curiosity of a man who has run out of surprises he hopes to meet. He was boiling coffee when he heard the clatter of a vehicle too sharp for a rancher's wagon, too polished for a mule train. He stepped out, thumb hooked in his belt, and saw a buggy rolling like it owned the road, lacquered wheels throwing off clean, self-satisfied light. The man driving wore a black coat despite the heat, a hat with a ribbon a shade too dark to be decent, and a mustache that had been curated more than grown. The buggy was from the bank in town. The man was from the part of the world that never got dust under its nails. "You, Ezekiel Boone?" he called, drawing rein with the tiniest flourish. "On my better days," Ezekiel said. Clementine appeared at his shoulder, chewing the end of a rope from somewhere she found it. The man clambered down, tied the reins in a knot that would hold if prayer failed, and produced a ledger the size of a family Bible. "Alabaster Finch," he announced, "acting manager of the Las Piedras Savings and Mercantile, though we render services to this area when needful. I've come on a matter of account specifically, your note." Ezekiel didn't need to be told which note. $19, and some sense had stood between him and ownership of this harsh sketch of land for a year. He'd ground it down to $18, and a little more with fence mending and a winter of taking his coffee black. He waited. Finch adjusted his spectacles as if they were nervous and continued. You are. In arrears, Finch said, the words popping out like nails from tired wood. Ordinarily, the bank would proceed along foreclosing lines. However, the bank finds itself in an awkward position concerning a certain property acquired in tax default. Ezekiel looked at Clementine. She had found a fly and was addressing it with slow, deadly concentration. Sir, he said to Finch, I have a profound love of simple sentences. Finch blinked, regrouped. We took title to a place called Prospector's Rest, Ghost Town. The mine closed after a cave-in sometime around '69. Nobody to pay county taxes. The owner of record expired. No heirs. It's become a liability. Vandals, drunkards, owls. Owls, Ezekiel said gravely. Owls, Finch said, as if naming a criminal enterprise. Now, you owe $18. The bank would like the matter closed. If you were to purchase Prospector's Rest, we could apply a discount to the arrears, owing to the removal of this unfortunate asset from our books. He swallowed. $2. The number fell between them and sat catching sunlight. Clementine stopped hunting flies long enough to blow through her nose. Ezekiel studied Finch the way a man studies a sky that might mean rain. You're telling me I can square my debt by buying a ghost town for $2. Strictly speaking, Finch said, brightening, the debt remains. But the sale provides sufficient consideration that my superiors will consent to write off your arrears as a courtesy, and the liability is removed. Prospector's Rest becomes yours free and clear. You will, of course, be responsible for any future taxes, which, given the properties, lack of productive enterprise. I get it, Ezekiel said. He motioned to the shade by the lean-to, poured Finch a tin cup of coffee that made the banker's eyes water politely, and sat on a crate. He looked north across his land. The light had sharpened. The dust devil had grown bored and dissolved. He thought of winter's nights and graves up on the ridge, of the way the shacks sighed in the wind like an old man in a rocker. He pictured Prospector's Rest, though he had never seen it blank windows, a crooked street, a mine sealed like a mouth. Clementine stepped between the men and nosed Finch's ledger. Finch flinched as if assaulted by a philosophy. Your donkey's inquisitive. Finch said, she likes to understand what she's buying, Ezekiel said. He went inside and came back with a tobacco tin. Inside were the last things he had not spent. A silver dollar with wear in the face where Liberty's eye had been thumbed away by somebody's worry, and a limp greenback that had survived a wash and a winter. He laid them in Finch's palm. $2, he said, and you draw me papers. Finch stared. You now? Before the wind changes. Ezekiel didn't trust hope to sit still long enough to be caught and branded. He trusted momentum. He trusted the way Clementine had planted herself by Finch's buggy, as if to say, we're going. They worked at a makeshift desk. Finch hunched over the buggy's seat, ledger balanced on his knee, the ink drying in fishbone streaks. He wrote out an instrument in his beautiful, fussy hand, muttering phrases like assigns, heirs, and personal representatives. He put his seal to it with a stamp and a flourish that suggested theater tickets. Ezekiel wrote his name slow and steady, every letter like a fence post planted deep. Finch cleared his throat. You understand, Mr. Boone, this is an odd arrangement. The bank is not in the business of charity. I never asked for charity, Ezekiel said. Just a door that opens. When Finch was gone, buggy rolling away in a shimmer, the ledger tucked under his arm, and his relief practically flapping behind the wheels. Ezekiel stood with the deed in his hand and the weights in his chest rearranging themselves into something lighter. The paper felt both flimsy and impossible. He folded it into his shirt like a wound dressing and turned to Clementine. "Well," he said, "I guess we're townsfolk." They left at dawn the next day, with the shack shuttered, the water barrels topped, and everything worth keeping packed into 2 bedrolls, a sack of beans, a coffee pot, a skillet black as sin, and a Bible whose cover had been thumbed to soft leather years ago. Ezekiel strapped the lot onto Clementine with a care that suggested he was lashing his doubts in place too. The road to prospectors. Rest wasn't a road so much as a suggestion made by wagon. Ruts and a habit of heading west until the sky felt different. The first miles went easy, with the air still cool and the world pretending to be generous. Quail skittered. A red-tailed hawk unspooled above them like a ribbon. Ezekiel walked and Clementine plodded, and the rhythm was a kind of healing left. Right breath. Left, right, breath. By mid-morning, the light had turned hard. Heat came up from the earth in waves that made the horizon flutter. They passed a windmill half fallen, its blades clacking like a tired metronome. Ezekiel stopped and pulled the cotter pin, stilled it, and rubbed the iron with his palm. "You sound like my bones," he said. Clementine nosed the trough, then him, and he gave her a ladle of water. They drank in turns 3 swallows for her, 1 for him, until he closed the canteen again. He knew better than to squander. Deeds didn't change the desert. At noon, they found a strip of shade under a mesquite big enough to put up an argument. Ezekiel set a tin cup full of beans to soak, took the harmonica from his pocket, and limbered his fingers. He hadn't played since, well, he had a tune his boy had loved once, something quick and silly about a cowboy with a crooked hat. He put the harmonica to his mouth, and the first note came out like a bird that had forgotten how to fly. He tried again and found the shape of it. Forefinger tapped his knee. Clementine listened with heavy-lidded patience until the tune slid into something older, nearer. "My God, to thee," because sometimes you don't choose your songs. They choose you. He stopped before the memories got teeth. They walked on. The land rolled up and down in low humps. Larkspur shivered in patches. A coyote paused on a ridge, thin and curious, then slipped away without malice. The afternoon stretched and stretched like rawhide under a sun too bright to be looked at. Ezekiel counted steps without meaning to. At 4 miles, he promised Clementine a carrot if he could find one. At 5, he promised her chief justiceship of the Supreme Court. She flicked an ear at him. The carrot promise impressed her more. They made camp where a dry arroyo indicated there might be water if, against all odds, it rained. Ezekiel collected wood, scraped a shallow fire pit, and found a blue rock the size of a fist to serve as a pot rest. Night came down indigo and sudden. The stars were a billion cold nails hammered into a black board. He cooked beans with a pinch of salt and a single dried chili. They swallowed and burned, and satisfied more than their smallness ought to have allowed. Clementine got a double measure of oats she'd earned twice. Ezekiel took the folded paper from his shirt and read it by Firelight Prospector's Rest, known and described as lots 1 through. He smiled at the pump, at the idea that someone somewhere had numbered these sun-rotted boards and expected them to obey arithmetic. He tucked the deed under his bedroll. Sleep found him in pieces, but when it did not drag him through. The fever nights. He dreamed he was standing in an open doorway, and there was a bell clanging somewhere, and the wind was carrying the smell of cut lumber and beer. The second day, the horizon pulled back a little further. The ruts steepened and led them along a dry wash, framed with cottonwoods that had learned to drink from sand. A few boards littered the banked pail, uniform cut, nail holes regular. Ezekiel picked one up and turned it in his hands. "Old roadwork, maybe," he said, "or beginnings of an ending." Clementine ignored him and stared into the distance, ears high, as if some far-off thing had breathed her name. Late afternoon, With shadows long and the light turning to the color of brass, they topped a low. Rise and saw it. Prospector's Rest. A sign lay canted on two nails. The town's name burned into it, the letters clean and stubborn against the sun. Someone had once painted population figures, 742, then scratched them out and written 361, then scratched again and written 27, then left the arithmetic to owls. The street was a shallow dish of dust lined by buildings in various states of remembering themselves, false fronts still ambitious, porches missing planks like smiles with teeth gone, a church with a steeple that leaned as if it had grown tired of pointing heavenward with no takers. At the far end, a mouth of a mine, timber-framed and black, was banded shut with a gate of wood gone gray. Ezekiel stood there longer than the moment required, hat in his hands, feeling something unbuckle in his chest. A town was a shape a man could pour himself into. Even empty, it held a promise of edges. He looked at Clementine. She took 2 bold steps forward, then another, hooves clicking on something under the dust. She nodded, satisfied, and started down as if she'd been elected. They went slow along the street. Each building introduced itself with a sign that had endured sun and wind better than the structures they named. Marshall, Assayer, Hotel, Dentist. Ezekiel gave this a skeptical glance. Sheena Laundry, Barber, Mercantile. The saloon's batwings hung by one hinge, so sunburnt the grain showed like ribs. Inside, the bar was a length of scarred walnut, the mirror behind it mostly silvered back into fog. A row of glasses stood on a shelf, each one holding a spoonful of desert layered by years. Home sweet clutter, Ezekiel said. He pushed aside the batwings and stepped into air 2 degrees cooler than the street. Clementine followed without hesitation, then veered right and stuck her head into a doorway where the painted letters still read Mayor. She snorted, stepped over the threshold carefully, and began to nose through a tangle of paper and leather. Ledgers, as serious as a clerk. Fine, Ezekiel said. Guess you're mayor now. He made a circuit. The second floor was a gallery of rooms with beds that had forgotten men. A poker table sat under a layer of dust, like a snowdrift waiting 6 months late. In a back closet, he found a broom with a few bristles left and a stack of lamp chimneys wrapped in old newspaper. He shook one out an article about the mine, dated 8 years back, noting an accident that had curtailed operations pending safety improvements. He folded the paper and slid it into his pocket with the deed. Out front, he unrolled his bedroll behind the bar with the coziness of a man who has slept in worse places than every place. He hung his cookpot from a hook meant for lanterns. It swung gently and clicked against the wood as if to say it approved. He opened the batwings so the evening could walk through. Clementine set up municipal government in the mayor's office. With such calm authority, he could almost hear the imaginary gavel. The air smelled the way old places do of wood gone to paper, of iron filings, of something like regret that turned, if you breathed deeper, into memory. He lit a lamp, and the light wobbled, then settled, painting the room in honey. He sat on the floor, back to the bar, and fished the harmonica out of his pocket. The first notes of the crooked hat cowboy tune shook a little. By the time he found the chorus, the saloon had begun to remember what music was. He played softer, then stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was held expectant, as if every nail had leaned in. Outside, something creaked, a sign shifting in a patient wind, a shutter catching and releasing. Ezekiel stood and went to the doorway. The street lay in a tangerine hush. Above the mine, swallows stitched the sky. He glanced that way, involuntarily, the way a man glances at a locked trunk, even when he has no reason to think there's anything in it. Clementine had come to stand beside him, shoulder warm against his leg. She too watched the mine. Her ears those ridiculous banners of attention tilted, as if listening for a faint sound under the world's noise. "Not tonight," he told her, softer than he meant. "We got time." He closed the batwings as the sky bruised purple and set about making supper. Beans again, he told himself it was tradition, not necessity. He cracked the chili smaller and laughed when the heat bit him anyway. He gave Clementine her oats in a pat, and because he was a man of his word, he cut the last carrot into neat coins and laid them on his palm. She took them delicately, lips as soft as moth wings, and breathed gratitude across his knuckles. After, he unfolded the deed and smoothed it on the bar. He read it one more time and touched the place where his name had been laid like a brand. Ezekiel Boone, owner. The words rang odd. Not because of the ownership, he'd owned hardship and silence for years, but because of the way the last word sat. Town. It had edges to sweep, hinges to oil, chairs to straighten, windows to set. Back into tracks. It had a future the way a seed has a tree locked inside it, if weather and time can be convinced to cooperate. He blew out the lamp and lay back. The ceiling held a map of knots he was certain he'd learn as well as any star chart. From somewhere in the bones of the building, a soft settling noise answered the cooling night. Clementine shifted in the yo office and let out a contented gust of breath that meant, in donkey language, "Here will do." The desert's night creatures tuned up a quiet orchestra, one violin at a time, crickets first, then something that might have been a nightjar, then the soft scritch of little feet under the floorboards that Ezekiel would deal with tomorrow. He set his palm over the deed beside his bedroll, as if to keep it from blowing away, and watched his breath feather the dust motes until they disappeared into dark. He did not think of graves on the ridge. He did not count his losses. He counted, instead, the doors in this town, and the chairs, and the prospects of hinges. A man couldn't mend a past. He could sometimes mend a hinge dot in the last slice. Of waking, as stars shuffled behind the slats of the shutters, he heard Clementine's hooves tap once on old floorboards, 2 measured knocks, like someone asking permission to enter their own home. He smiled, eyes closed. "Come on in, Madam Mayor," he said, and sleep took him before he could hear her answer. Asterisk morning took its time coming, as if uncertain the town was worth the trouble. When the light finally broke, it slid through cracked shutters and found Ezekiel already up, rolling his sleeves and squaring his shoulders to work. The saloon smelled of old oak and dust, a smell that meant the day would give back exactly what a man put into it. He started with a broom that had 3 good bristles and 5 that were trying. Each push drew a pale road through the dust, and each road revealed something. A poker chip, a nail bent once and reconsidered, a coin so thin with handling that both faces had gone shy. He lined the findings on the bar like recruits awaiting orders. Clementine watched from the mayor's office doorway, ears pricked, lower lip working as if she were chewing the town's minutes into something digestible. "You preside," Ezekiel said, sweeping another lane. "I'll legislate." He opened windows one by one, working the swollen frames with the patience of a man who's argued with weather before. Outside, the street lay empty and bright. Wind tugged at a sign and found nothing worth stealing. By the time he finished, the saloon had raised itself one notch from ruin toward habitability. He set the broom aside with ceremony, made coffee strong enough to fix a fence, and took a tin cup to stand on the porch. From there, the town showed its seams, porches tilted different ways. A hitching rail leaned into its shadow like an old man into a cane. Far down the street, the mine sat behind its gate, 2 crossbars lashed with rusted chain, timber uprights weathered to a dull gray, the color of winter river stones. The whole thing had the feel of a mouth a dentist had wired shut and then moved away Clementine clopped down off the saloon step, crossed the street, and sniffed the town pump. Ezekiel followed, primed the handle, and worked it slow. For a while there was nothing but the clack of iron and the dry sigh of leather gaskets. Then water came up reluctant, brown as tea, and then clear. He let it run into his palm and tasted. Iron and limestone, the faint sweetness of old pipes. Not bad. He filled a bucket, set it for Clementine, and watched her drink. Jaw working with grave gratitude, they toured the buildings like cautious buyers at a bankruptcy sale. The barber's was all mirror and ghosts of talk. The chairs faced the glass, the way pews face an altar. The china laundry held wooden tubs, and a string of blue-printed paper charms over the door. Faded to the color of the sky at dawn. The dentist's office contained the expected chair and a wicked array of instruments that made Ezekiel's gums ache just to look at them. He closed that door with finality. Out in the mercantile, he found a thin miracle. Shelves of goods sealed in wax and luck. A tin of molasses, a crate of perfectly good nails, a spool of twine and one of thread, a box of matches dry as hymn paper. Behind the counter, a ledger with columns as neat as pickets. The last entry read, Mrs. D. Murphy Calico, 2 ids. Lamp oil 1 pint. Biscuit flour 10 pounds. Credit extended pending payday. The date curled in on itself, 8 years old. Ezekiel touched the page with his thumb as if he could smooth the debt forward into the present. The church felt larger than it was. A cracked bell rope hung from the belfry, its fibers polished by hands that had asked and thanked. The pulpit leaned. The pews hadn't forgotten how to hold a man's weight. Ezekiel sat in the back like any visitor and let the silence do his thinking. He didn't pray. He counted, which is the same thing sometimes planks to mend, panes to set, shingles to understand. When he rose, he took a length of the bell rope and twined it into a loop for door latches, because it is foolish to let rope go to waste and a comfort to carry. Even a frayed echo of a bell, that by midday the sun had convinced every dry thing to smell. Alive. Ezekiel ate cold beans on the saloon porch, eyes half-lidded the way men's eyes go when they're counting more than they want to admit. Clementine stood in the street square as a courthouse and watched the mine. Whenever he looked away, her ears drifted toward that black mouth and then flicked back as if embarrassed to be caught staring. All right, Ezekiel said at last, surrendering because he always would to that stubborn face. Let's see your interest. The mine stood the way closed things do, dignified, wary. A sign bolted to one post had letters burned deep. Close of operations pending improvements, it explained. Beneath, a second line, trespass by order OF, and then someone, long ago, had shot the rest away. A company notice with no company left. He checked the gate. The crossbars had warped. The chain was rust and memory. He could have kicked the whole business aside, but he didn't. There is a kind of pride in leaving something closed that wants to be. He traced the grain of the timber and felt where a hand had done the same years earlier, the oil of it still. A suggestion. Not today, he said. Clementine snorted, unimpressed. She circled the gate with the studied patience of an appraiser, nose to the ground, hooves landing soft as a cat's. Twice she stopped and pawed once, testing, and moved. On. The third time, she did not move on. She brayed low, a sound with question marks in it, and began to dig the way donkeys do. Economical, relentless, small motions that grow into something. Leave it, girl, Ezekiel called from the porch where he'd returned to finish his lunch. That's rattler country. Clementine's ear twitched in acknowledgement and dismissal. Dust lifted, stones rolled. Ezekiel set down his tin and walked back, slow, because hurrying helps nothing. He scanned the ground for the S-shaped motion he didn't want to see, and heard other noises, too, the faint creak of timbers as the day warmed them, the dry clatter of a grasshopper making decisions. He was 3 paces away when Clementine's hoof scraped something that sounded wrong for rock. Not hollow wrong, bright wrong, a ping in the throat of the earth. She threw back her head in triumph and pawed again. A chunk of white quartz came free, edges shining where her hoof had cleaved it, the fracture plane smooth as a promise. Through the white ran veins of yellow that didn't wink like mica, but glowed like something with its own small sun. Ezekiel felt 2 thoughts arrive in his skull the way morning and evening arrive at a window. First, that's gold. Second, keep your face still. He crouched and picked up the stone. It fit his palm as if his hand had been waiting for exactly that weight. The yellow in it wasn't dust. It ran in lines like seen-through roots, thicker than he'd expected, thicker even than hope should allow. He turned it and watched the light change its mind. Asterisk. Well, he said softly. Clementine nosed his shoulder, breathed on his ear, and tried to take the stone into her own possession. He laughed despite the small storm gathering in his blood and held it out for her to smell. She gave it 2 huffs, found it unpalatable, and eyed his pockets. Payment rendered, he said. He went back to the saloon, dug down in the sack, and cut the last stubby carrot into coins. Clementine accepted them with that careful delicacy that always surprised him, a big mouth arranging itself around small sweetness. Ezekiel set the quartz on the bar and went looking for a hammer. The mercantile yielded one, head loose, handle chewed by a bored dog. He wrapped the handle at the neck with that piece of frayed bell rope, tightened the fit with a wedge of scrap, and tested the swing. In the quiet, he brought the hammer down on a thin branch of quartz, bridging the main piece and a thinner tail. The bar rang once, clear. The chunk broke cleanly. He picked up the smaller piece, no bigger than a biscuit, and held it to the window. He had seen gold before. Years back, he'd worked a season on a claim up near Taos, more hunger than wages, but enough to learn the look of the real thing, the way it seemed to drink light rather than throwing it back, the way it sat lazy in the rock like a sated cat. This was that. He did not whoop. He did not even smile. He felt something in his chest stand up and stretch, a part of him that had been lying down for years. He wrapped the biscuit-sized piece in a torn scrap of newspaper from the saloon shelf, an advertisement for a patent tonic that could cure rheumatism, lumbago, and widowhood, and tucked it into the tobacco tin where the deed had slept. The larger piece he placed on a shelf behind the bar and nudged a cracked whiskey bottle in front of it, then a chipped glass, then a stack of plates. It vanished the way valuable things must sometimes vanish, in plain sight, made messy. Clementine had returned to the mine and resumed her slow perimeter. He followed, scanning the ground for any other churned-up promises. There were none. The earth had offered a single word and closed its mouth. He squatted on his heels and rested his forearms on his knees, the way men do who don't want to give their backs any ideas. "How do you know?" he asked. Clementine flicked an ear back at him, then toward the earth. He took that for both compliment and guidance. He did not open the gate that afternoon. He did not go fetch a pick or set a wedge. He walked the length of the street instead, letting his feet learn the town's measure. He memorized the distance from the saloon to the well and steps, the angle of sun that put shade over the assayer's stoop, the way sound traveled, how a clink in the bar echoed into the street, but not into the church, how a bray at the mine came back as a question. He filed every small fact, where he kept weather, water, and the temper of animals dot as the day aged. Toward evening, a traveler came. Ezekiel heard the approach before he saw it. Creak of leather, soft clop of a single horse, the familiar rhythm of a man riding, because walking would be worse. The rider appeared from the east, lean as a crowbar, hat brimmed straight, dust to his boot tops. He slowed his men slow when the world changes around a corner, eyes cutting right, left, then easing as he realized the cut was of absence, not threat. "Howdy," he called, the word a probe. "Howdy," Ezekiel answered, easy, one hand on the doorframe of the saloon. The rider took in the open bat wings, the bucket by the pump, the animal posted at the mine, with the attention of a federal judge. "Town open again?" he asked. "Town tidying again," Ezekiel said. "You're welcome. To the porch shade and a cup of coffee if you don't mind it dark." The man considered that offer against the ledger in his head that included his canteen, the heat, and the distance to anywhere else. He dismounted with the noise of leather easing. The horse nosed the trough, drank, and nosed it again, just in case generosity had deepened the well. Ezekiel poured coffee and handed over a tin mug. The man drank, made a face that wasn't exactly pain, and nodded. "Name of Jory Pike," he said. "You the marshal? Mayor? Undertaker?" "All of the above, until we can find a committee." Ezekiel said, "Boom." They spoke the language of strangers who might become neighbors. "Where from? Where to? How's the grass down past Arroyo Seco? Did you hear the army's pulling out of Fort Lowell? Any storms out of the east?" Jory's eyes kept going past Ezekiel's shoulder down the street to the mine. Not avid, not greedy, just the way a man's eyes go when the dark part of a map raises a question. "Used to be a good camp," Jory said. "Good folks, bad luck. Heard the cave-in took the best of them." "Seems that way," Ezekiel said. He ran a thumb under the rim of his mug, thinking not of the gold wrapped in patent medicine newsprint, but of the ledger entry for Mrs. D. Murphy. He didn't like the feeling of not telling, but he liked even less the consequences of telling. The West has rules. One of them, a whisper can stampede men faster than thunder can horses. Jory finished his coffee, thanked a second time, and hauled up. "You see any bandits, you tell them Jory Pike already robbed you of the worst coffee. In 3 counties, he said, and grinned. "Kidding, it's potent. Good luck to you, Boone. And you." Ezekiel watched him ride away until the heat haze took him, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He counted reasons: quiet, safety, time, and added one he didn't like. He did not yet trust himself with what he might find if he swung a pick into that dark. The evening was all brass and then all violet. He cooked with the thrift of a man who means to have breakfast tomorrow. Clementine got her oats and a longer rub along the neck. He stepped into the church and laid his hand on the bell's bronze skirt. It shifted a hair on its frame and made a sound so small it could have been a memory clearing its throat. He took his harmonica onto the saloon porch and played until the light had no place left to land. This time he didn't avoid the church tune. He laid it right in the middle of the crooked cowboy song and let them make an uneasy peace. When he stopped, the quiet seemed satisfied. Before turning in, he took the tobacco tin out, opened it, and looked one more time at the biscuit-sized truth. He held it to the lamp and watched the gold swallow the flame without blinking. He thought of his boy's laugh. He thought of promise and the ruin it comes wrapped in. He thought, finally, of doors, how some want to be opened and some want you to wait until they open themselves. He snapped the tin shut and tucked it under a loose floorboard behind the bar. He slid the plank back, set the chair on top, and tested the squeak. It still complained exactly the way a chair should. Clementine padded in, hooves soft on old boards, and stationed herself in the mayor's office. Ezekiel lay down behind the bar, hat over his eyes, the day's sweat cooling into tomorrow's smell. Somewhere far out beyond the ridge, a coyote said he was still alive. Somewhere nearer, a shutter learned a new note in the night wind. Ezekiel slept and dreamed of the mine gate swinging open on its own, slow and sure as a barn door in a story, and of a bell ringing not loud but steady, and of Clementine standing in sunlight with a piece of the earth at her feet. Stubborn as a Saint Dot in the dark small hours, he woke to a sound, 2 measured taps from the direction of the mine, like knuckles on wood. He sat up, listening hard, but the sound did not repeat. He lay back down, feeling the town hold its breath around him, and smiled because some places know your name before you tell them. Tomorrow, he said into the rafters, not sure whether. He meant the dusting or the digging or both. We'll talk tomorrow. The desert had a way of keeping secrets, but it also had a way of whispering them into the wrong ears. Ezekiel Boone learned that truth the same week Clementine pawed quartz out of the earth. For 2 days he did nothing but study the rock in his tobacco tin and weigh the silence of the town. The gold was real too real. The question wasn't whether it existed, but whether the world would let him keep it. Ezekiel had been around long enough to know that gold had a stink, invisible as smoke, but powerful enough to draw men from 50 miles in every direction. And he was right. Drifters at the gate. First stranger came 3 days later. A gambler, with a black hat, silk vest, and the kind of smile that promised trouble while apologizing for none of it. He introduced himself as Cade Lorimer, asked for whiskey, and pretended not to notice that the bottle Ezekiel poured from was half dust. Prospector's Rest, Cade said, rolling the name across his tongue like a card he meant to play. Didn't think anybody'd buy this old corpse of a town. What brings you here, rancher? Silence, Ezekiel said, flat. Cade grinned, but his eyes went measuring, the way a man's do when he's counting chairs in a saloon he might win in a poker hand. He noticed Clementine standing near the mine gate, ears cocked forward as if listening to music only she could hear. Funny thing about this place, Cade said. Word has it a whole vein of gold was lost in that mine. They say the last owner swore he found it before the cave-in. Called it the lost lode of Prospector's Rest. Never mapped it, never marked it. All gone. But they say it's still in there, waiting for a man with the stomach to dig. Ezekiel said nothing. He poured another drink for Cade, let silence be his only answer, and watched Clementine flick flies with her tail by nightfall. Cade was joined by 2 more drifters' pickaxes strapped to their saddles, eyes sharp with hunger. Then came another pair, then a wagon. The town began to breathe again, not with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat, but the ragged panting of fever. The fever returns within a week. Prospector's Rest had changed. Men lit lamps in the saloon, broke the silence with card games and arguments. The mercantile shelves were stripped of nails and matches. An old woman with a crow's voice opened a stew pot in the hotel kitchen, feeding hungry men for a pinch of dust. But the mine was the true altar. Every morning, men lined up at its mouth, swinging picks, hauling dirt, sweating through shirts that turned black with ore dust. Each claimed they might be the one to strike the lost lode. The cavern of gold whispered about in saloons as far as Tucson. The truth was uglier. Most men struck only stone, breathing rock dust that coated their lungs. A few found flakes, crumbs barely enough to keep them digging. Yet the fever grew. The rancher becomes Foreman Ezekiel had not invited any of them. Yet they treated him like the reluctant master of ceremonies. He was the only one with a deed. He was the man who had made the ghost town breathe again. And most of all, he had Clementine, the strange, stubborn donkey who knows the ground with unerring certainty. Where she stops, we dig, men whispered. Some called her a miracle beast, some a witch's mule. Ezekiel called her Clementine, and guarded her like a bank vault. Against his own wishes, he found himself in charge. He broke up fights with the flat of his shovel. He decided which shafts would be shored with timber, which would be abandoned as death traps. He stood at the saloon door each evening, silent as a judge, while prospectors shoved gold flakes across the table to pay for whiskey. It was a life he'd never wanted, but he wore it like an old coat ill-fitting. But his ghosts in the tunnels nights were restless. The mine seemed to whisper under the moon, timbers groaning as if old voices were trapped inside. Ezekiel dreamed of men he'd never met, faces half covered in dust, eyes wide with the terror of a cave collapsing. He'd wake with sweat freezing on his neck, Clementine's shadow steady in the doorway as though she too kept watch. Rumors grew faster than quartz veins. One man swore he'd found a skeleton in a side tunnel, clutching a rusted pick and a bag heavy with dust. Another claimed the lost lode wasn't gold at all, but silver cursed by Apache spirits. A third said the vein was real, but cursed by the last owner, who had sworn with his dying breath that no man would profit from it. The more the town filled with noise, the more Ezekiel listened for something quieter. Clementine's bray at dawn, the scrape of her hoof when she struck earth with intent. And then one stormy night, the truth began to show itself. Clementine's discovery rain hammered the rooftops, turning the street into a shallow creek. Lightning split the sky, white fire leaping from cloud to ridge. Thunder followed like cannon fire, shaking glass loose. From empty windows, Clementine bolted from the mayor's office, ears flat, hooves splashing through the rising water. Ezekiel grabbed a lantern and followed, cursing the storm, his heart hammering. She ran not to escape, but to lead straight toward the hills behind the mine. There, under the strike of lightning, the rain tore soil away from the slope. Clementine stopped dead, brayed once, and pawed furiously at the loosened rock. Ezekiel raised his lantern. Through the mud and fractured stone, he saw it, a collapsed shaft, long hidden, the timbers black with age, but unmistakable. The storm had uncovered what the desert had swallowed, the entrance to the lost lode. Clementine brayed again, ears high, as though announcing judgment. The sound echoed against the hills, louder than thunder, carrying into the town where men huddled. In the saloon, they looked up wide-eyed as the note rolled down the street. By morning, everyone in Prospector's Rest would know the donkey had found the way in. And for Ezekiel Boone, the lonely rancher who had bought a ghost town for $2, the quiet life was gone forever. Morning broke with a hush that felt wrong for a mining town. The storm had left the air sharp, rinsed clean of dust, but the men in Prospector's Rest moved like hounds scenting blood. They had heard Clementine's bray echo through the hills the night before, and now all eyes turned to the ridge where the storm had peeled back the earth. Ezekiel Boone didn't need to shout or wave his arms. He simply stood with the donkey at his side, hand resting on her withers, and the men parted to let him lead the way. They followed in a slow, reverent line, the gambler Cade Lorimer, the drifters with their bent picks, the cook with stew stains on her apron. All of them were bound together by a fever that didn't burn skin, but hollowed out reason. Gold fever. The reopened shaft, the collapsed shaft, gaped like a broken rib cage. Timbers splintered, the darkness behind them smelling of damp rock and time. Ezekiel lifted his lantern. Its light didn't touch the end of the black. Needs bracing, one of the miners muttered. Or she'll take us all down. Ezekiel nodded. Then we brace her. They set to work with the frantic patience of men who knew they stood on the edge of history. Trees came down from the hills. Axes rang until their arms shook. Mules hauled. Timbers, men hammered until sparks jumped in the dusk. Ezekiel directed the work with the steady authority of a man who had once built fences mile after mile in silence. Clementine watched, ears swiveling, ever straying far from the opening. When the braces were set and the first tunnel shored, she nosed Ezekiel's lantern with her soft lips, as if to say, "Go on, it's time." into the darkness. The first descent belonged to a handful of men, Ezekiel among them. Cade Lorimer insisted on joining, his grin sharper than the pickaxe he carried. "Wouldn't want the law of discovery to slip through my fingers," he said, though no one laughed. The tunnel was narrow, the air heavy with the weight of rock overhead. Each step echoed, lanterns throwing shifting shadows that looked like ghosts reaching from the walls. Ezekiel's throat tightened. He thought of the men who had died in the first cave-in, their shouts swallowed by the earth. But deeper they went, past collapsed boards, past rusted shovels left leaning against stone. The quartz veins on the wall grew thicker, spiderwebs of white, crisscrossed with lines of yellow. Cade ran his fingers over them, eyes gleaming. "Close," Cade whispered. "I can smell it." Ezekiel ignored him, focused instead on the rhythm of Clementine's hooves above ground, faint but steady as she pawed the dirt, keeping time with his heart. Then, with a sound like thunder muffled by miles of stone, the wall cracked. The floor shifted under their boots. Men scrambled back, lanterns swaying wildly as the rock face gave way with a roar. Dust swallowed them whole, choking, blinding, until at last it settled. And there it was. The cavern of gold. The lantern light licked across a cavern wide as a cathedral, its walls glittering with ore. Not flakes, not dust sheets and seams, whole. Rivers of gold frozen in the rock, glowing as though the sun had been buried here and never dimmed. Men fell silent. Cade Lorimer dropped his pick, the clatter lost against the weight of wonder. Someone whispered a prayer. Another man sobbed out. Ezekiel stood at the threshold, chest heaving, lantern trembling in his hand. He had seen wealth before cattle herds. That stretched for miles, nuggets that bought a man's freedom, but never anything like this. It wasn't a vein. It was a fortune so vast it mocked the very word $200 million, the assayer would later call it. Enough to build cities, to arm armies, to turn deserts into green fields. Enough to ruin every man who touched it. Clementine brayed above ground, loud and triumphant, the sound echoing down the shaft like a coronation. The cost of gold, the fever, broke in an instant and returned tenfold. Men rushed forward, clawing at the walls, scraping with bare hands. Cade shouted that the claim was his by right of discovery. Others cursed him, shoving, swinging picks. The cavern filled with noise shouts, metal on stone, boots scuffling. For advantage, Ezekiel raised his voice once. "Stop!" It carried like thunder, but it was swallowed by greed. He backed away, jaw clenched, and climbed out of the shaft. He didn't want to watch men turn into wolves. Outside, the night sky burned with stars, cold and indifferent. Clementine pressed her head against his chest. He stroked her coarse mane and whispered, "We should have kept it secret, girl. Buried it deeper instead of digging." But secrets were like gold. They never stayed buried. Richest rancher in the West, the month's end. Surveyors rode in with scales and ledgers, their spectacles flashing with dollar signs. They weighed samples, calculated veins, and announced the staggering truth. $200 million lay beneath. Prospectors rest. Newspapers carried the headline from Santa Fe to St. Louis. Lost lode found ghost town revived. The saloon filled nightly. The church bell rang again, and the streets hummed with wagons loaded with timber, ore, and men's impossible dreams. Ezekiel Boone was called the richest rancher in the West. Men slapped his back, begged him to sell, begged him to partner, begged him for crumbs. But he only shook his head and walked back to the saloon porch, where Clementine stood chewing placidly. Reporters asked him for his secret. He gave the same answer every time, scratching the donkey's ears as she leaned against him. "Wasn't?" He said. "It was the mayor here." And Clementine brayed, long and loud, as though to remind the world exactly who had found the fortune. Epilogue. The lonely no more. The ghost town of prospectors. Rest roared back to life. But Ezekiel Boone remained a quiet man. He fixed hinges, mended chairs, played his harmonica at dusk. The gold was there, the wealth undeniable, but he let the world chase it while he stayed in the shade of the saloon, content for after years. Of silence and loss, he had found something worth more than $200 million. He was no longer lonely. He had Clementine, stubborn and steady, the donkey who had turned 2 ragged dollars into a fortune, and who had reminded him that sometimes the greatest treasure was simply having company that never left your side.